Never thought I'd become the kind of man who sits in a parking lot at 2 in the morning watching a house waiting. I spent 23 years as a high school shop teacher in Dayton, Ohio. I coached JV baseball. I helped neighbors fix their gutters. I was the guy who brought casseroles to funerals. That's who I thought I was. Then my daughter married a man named Curtis Webb, and somewhere in the 18 months that followed, I became someone I don't fully recognize. My daughter, I'll call her by her name, Abby, was 26 when she met him. She just finished her nursing degree and was working at Miami Valley Hospital. Curtis was a general contractor, good-looking in that square-jawed, firm handshake way that makes people trust you before you've earned it. He had a nice truck, owned his own company, knew how to talk to fathers about football and property values. I liked him well enough the first few times we met. My wife, Carol, we've been married 31 years. She had reservations from the beginning. She told me once that he listened to Abby the way someone listens to background music. Present, but not really paying attention. I filed it away. First mistake. Abby and Curtis got married in the fall of the year she turned 27. Small ceremony at a venue out near Centerville. I walked her down the aisle and I cried the way fathers cry at weddings. The kind where you're smiling so hard your face hurts and the tears come out anyway. 8 months later, they had a son. They named him Miles. I became a grandfather at 53. Carol and I drove to their house in Beaver Creek every Sunday for lunch. Miles had this habit of grabbing your index finger with his whole fist and just holding on. I thought about that a lot later, the way that boy could hold on. I retired from teaching the spring Miles turned 1. Carol and I had talked about maybe doing some traveling, seeing the Southwest, finally making it to the Pacific Coast. But we stayed close to Beaver Creek. I'm not sure either of us said out loud why. The changes in Abby were gradual. That's the thing nobody tells you. It doesn't announce itself. There's no single moment where you can point and say, there, that's where it started. It's more like watching a photograph fade. You look at it every day and it seems the same, and then one day you pick it up and realize you can barely make out the original image. She started canceling Sunday lunches. Curtis had a new project, she'd say, or Miles was coming down with something, or they had plans. The excuses were always reasonable, and they were delivered in a voice that was just slightly too rehearsed, the way you recite something you've been told to say until it sounds natural. Carol would hang up the phone and sit quietly for a moment before she said anything. That worried me more than the cancellations. I started dropping by unannounced. Not often. I didn't want to be that father-in-law, the one who doesn't respect boundaries. But enough, and what I noticed was this. Abby was always dressed nicely when Curtis was home. Hair done, makeup on. Not in a confident way. In a careful way, like she was performing. When I came by and Curtis wasn't there, she looked thinner and she laughed too quickly at nothing. Once I noticed a bruise on her forearm. Faint, yellowish, almost healed. She said she'd bumped into a cabinet door at work. I nodded. I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. I want to be honest about something. I didn't act on it. I told myself I might be wrong. I told myself Abby was an adult, a trained nurse who dealt with real emergencies every day, and she would tell us if something was wrong. I told myself that if I pushed too hard, I'd damage our relationship and she'd pull further away. Some of those reasons were valid. Some of them were just the comfortable packaging around the fact that I was afraid of what I might have to do if I confirmed what I suspected. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in March. I was in the garage rebuilding a carburetor for a '68 Chevelle I'd been working on for 2 years. My phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. It was Abby. She was using a neighbor's phone. Her voice was so flat and quiet I had to press the phone hard against my ear to hear her. "Dad," she said, "I need you to come. Don't call ahead. Don't call Curtis. Just come." I was in my truck in 40 seconds. I didn't change out of my work clothes. I didn't tell Carol where I was going because I didn't know what I'd find, and I didn't want her to hear me describe it over the phone while I was driving 70 miles an hour on I-605. When I pulled up to their house, Curtis's truck was gone. Abby answered the door, and I understood immediately why she hadn't wanted to call from her own phone. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut. There was a cut above her cheekbone that had been clean but not bandaged. She was holding Miles on her hip. He was 14 months old. He looked up at me with those serious gray eyes he gets from Carol's side of the family, and he put his head down on Abby's shoulder. I don't have words for what happened inside me at that moment. I've tried to find them. The closest I can get is this. Something structural shifted, like a load-bearing wall going out. Like the thing that had been holding the careful, reasonable version of me in place simply gave way. I got them out of the house that afternoon. Abby packed a bag for Miles and a small duffel for herself while I stood in the entryway. She moved quickly, efficiently, the way trauma nurses move. She'd clearly thought about this moment before. She just hadn't been able to get herself to the phone until that day. We drove to our house. Carol took one look at Abby's face and didn't say anything for the first few seconds. Then she took Miles from Abby's arms and carried him to the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator open, heard her asking Miles if he wanted some yogurt, heard Miles say something that sounded like yes. That was Carol holding everything together so Abby could fall apart in the hallway with me for 5 minutes before she had to be okay again. We called the police that evening. An officer came to the house, took Abby's statement, photographed her injuries. He told us that with her statement, the photographs, and her medical history, Abby had documentation going back 8 months of injuries she'd reported to her own physician but had not, until now, attributed to Curtis. There was enough to arrest him. Curtis was picked up at a friend's house in Kettering around 10 o'clock that night. I thought that was where the story was supposed to end, or at least where the next chapter was supposed to begin. I was wrong. Curtis's lawyer got him released on bond by Friday afternoon, $20,000, 10% down. His parents put up the money. His father called our house that evening and told Carol, I wasn't in the room, that Abby was troubled and had a history of instability, and that this was all a misunderstanding that was going to be straightened out very soon. Carol said, "Don't call here again," and hung up the phone. The court issued a protection order. Curtis could not contact Abby or come within 500 feet of our home. What the order could not do was make him stop. He had a friend file a civil harassment claim against Abby, claiming she damaged his professional reputation. His lawyer filed a motion contesting the protection order on procedural grounds. He showed up at Miami Valley Hospital, where Abby worked, twice in the first week, staying just outside the 500-foot limit each time, standing there long enough to make sure she could see him, then leaving. The criminal case was set for a preliminary hearing 6 weeks out. The assistant DA assigned to the case was capable and clearly taken it seriously, but she had a caseload that would flatten most people. She told us the case was solid, but that Curtis's lawyer was going to push for diversion, first-time domestic offense, voluntary counseling, maybe community service, charges held in abeyance pending compliance. If he completed the program, the charges would be dismissed. He'd done this to my daughter for over a year, split her lip twice, cracked 2 ribs that she'd told her doctor she got from a fall at work, put her in a position where she was calling me from a neighbor's phone because she was afraid of what he'd do if he found out she'd used her own. And the system's answer was anger management class and some community hours. I went to the gym every morning that week. I am not a gym person. I am a man who has a pull-up bar in the garage and does push-ups when something is bothering him. That week, I drove to a Planet Fitness on Wilmington Pike at 5:30 every morning and used the heavy bag in the corner for 45 minutes because it was the only thing that made the pressure in my chest go down enough to function. I want to be honest about this part too. I knew what I was thinking about. I knew it the way you know when you've made a decision before you've consciously admitted it. I watched Curtis's patterns for 2 weeks. He was staying with a friend in Centerville, a guy named, I looked him up, with a house on a cul-de-sac off Feedwire Road. Curtis left at 7:45 most mornings for job sites. He worked out at a gym near his office in the afternoons. On Fridays, he went to a sports bar in Springboro with guys from work, stayed until 9 or 9:30, and drove himself home. I know how this sounds. I know what it makes me. Miles had started waking up at night. He wasn't old enough to understand what had happened, but children understand more than we give them credit for, and he could feel the disruption. He'd cry out in the night, and Abby would go to him, and some nights I could hear her in there talking to him in that soft voice she used, telling him it was okay, that she was there, that everything was going to be okay. I'd lie in bed next to Carol and stare at the ceiling and think about what Curtis Webb had taken from that boy's sense of the world being safe. 2 weeks after the bond hearing, I drove to Springboro on a Friday night. I parked 3 blocks from the sports bar and walked. I had a hat pulled down. I'm 53 years old, gray at the temples. Nothing remarkable. Nobody looked at me. Curtis came out at 9:15 with 2 other men. They stood in the parking lot talking. One of them drove away. The other went back inside. Curtis walked to his truck alone. I stepped out from between 2 cars. Curtis. He turned around. He saw me and his jaw tightened. "Mr. Harmon, you should know your daughter put me in a position that's cost me." "I'm not here to talk about positions," I said. He was taller than me by 2 inches and outweighed me by 30 pounds. He took a step toward me in the way men do when they want to use their size as punctuation. "You need to walk back to wherever you parked and go home," he said, "because I will call the police and tell them you came here to threaten me." "I didn't come to threaten you," I said. "I came to ask you a question." He stopped. Something in my voice, maybe. "My daughter has documentation of 8 months of injuries," I said. "Her doctor has it. The DA has it. 8 months. The earliest entry is from 14 months ago, which means it started before Miles was born. I want to know if you ever hurt him." Something crossed his face. He opened his mouth. "Think carefully," I said. "I never touched Miles," he said, and his voice had changed. The combative edge was gone. He was defensive in a different way, the way that means the question landed somewhere true. "He's my son." "Abby is your wife," I said. He didn't have an answer for that. What happened next is something I've spent months deciding whether to put into words. I had a recorder in my jacket pocket. I'd looked up Ohio's recording consent laws. Ohio is a one-party consent state, meaning if you're part of a conversation, you can legally record it. I pressed record before I got out of the truck. I asked him to explain, in his own words, what had happened between him and Abby over the past 18 months. He talked. I think he thought I was there to negotiate some kind of understanding. The way men like him believe everything is ultimately a negotiation. He talked for nearly 20 minutes in that parking lot. He minimized, he justified, he partially admitted, and in the partial admissions, there was enough. He said he'd grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks because she contradicted him in front of his parents. He said the incident in March, the black eye, the cut, had happened because she'd threatened to take Miles away and he'd reacted without thinking. He used that phrase 3 times, reacted without thinking, like it was a weather pattern that had moved through him, like he'd had nothing to do with it. He said there'd been an incident he hadn't told his lawyer about, before Miles was born, when Abby was 6 months pregnant. He didn't elaborate and I didn't push, because I couldn't push or I would have done something that would have ended differently than I wanted it to. I just let him talk. I forwarded the recording to the assistant DA the next morning. I told her I'd had a voluntary conversation with Curtis Webb in a public parking lot, that I was a party to the conversation and that Ohio law permitted me to record it. I asked her to listen to the whole thing before she decided what to do with it. She called me back 3 hours later. Curtis's lawyer tried to have the recording excluded. The argument was coercion, that I'd intimidated his client into speaking. The DA's office argued that I was a private citizen who had a conversation in a parking lot, that no threats were made, and that Curtis had voluntarily continued the conversation for 20 minutes while free to leave at any time. The judge allowed the recording. Curtis Webb pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony domestic violence, the March incident, and the earlier incident he described in the parking lot. Rather than face trial with the recording and evidence, he was sentenced to 30 months in the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. The diversion program was off the table. His lawyer was visibly angry at the sentencing hearing. Curtis looked at Abby across the courtroom, and I was ready to stand up, but he just looked away. Abby filed for divorce while he was awaiting sentencing. She got full custody of Miles. Curtis has supervised visitation rights once he's released, assuming he completes a domestic violence intervention program, and even then visits will be supervised by a court-appointed monitor for the first 2 years. His parents have threatened to contest custody. Their attorney sent a letter. Our attorney sent a letter back that I am told was comprehensive. Here's what I want to say about the recording and what I did and whether it was right. It was legal. I made sure of that before I did it. But legal and right don't always share the same address, and I've thought about this enough to know the difference. I went to that parking lot with something in mind. I wasn't just a father having a conversation. I was building a case. I was doing deliberately what I wasn't sure the system would do on the timeline that mattered, which was before a diversion agreement was signed and the record was wiped clean and Curtis Webb was free to start over with someone else. Was I wrong to do it? I don't have a clean answer. I have a daughter who's sleeping through the night again. I have a grandson who has started to let other people hold him again, who had gone through a period where he'd only go to Abby or Carol. Like some part of him had learned that men were unpredictable. He sat on my lap last Sunday and fell asleep during the fourth quarter of the game. I didn't move for 2 hours. Carol brought me a blanket. Some nights I lie awake and think about that parking lot, about the recording running in my pocket, about the decision I'd made before I consciously made it. My brother-in-law, who's a retired cop, told me when I finally told him the whole story, about 3 months after the sentencing, that I was either very smart or very lucky and probably some of both. He also told me not to tell anyone else. The DA's office closed its file. Curtis's lawyer never pursued the intimidation angle because pursuing it would have required putting Curtis on the stand to explain what he'd said in that parking lot voluntarily for 20 minutes. That was not a conversation his lawyer wanted a jury to hear. Abby started a support group at her hospital for nurses who are experiencing domestic violence. The profession has a complicated relationship with asking for help because helping is what you do, not receiving it. The group meets every other Thursday. She told me about it on one of our Sunday lunches. The kind we're having again now, every week. Miles in his high chair destroying a grilled cheese sandwich. She said it almost casually. The way she says things she's proud of, but doesn't want to make a big deal. I said something like, "That's wonderful, Abs." She shrugged and asked if I wanted more coffee. Last week, she showed me something Miles had done in the church nursery, a finger painting. Green and blue swirls with one big orange shape in the middle. The nursery teacher had written in the corner, in pencil, "Daddy." Abby told me he pointed to the orange shape and said it himself, "Daddy," and that when the teacher had asked which daddy, he'd looked at the door like he was expecting someone to walk through it. She told me this story and watched my face while she told it. I don't know what Miles understands about what happened. I don't know what he'll understand when he's older. I know that children are told simplified versions of complicated things, and that the full version waits for them on the other side of some future conversation neither of us is ready for yet. What I know is that every Sunday he reaches for me when I come through the door, that he says "Papa" now, clearly, like he's been saying it for years, that he holds on. There's something Abby said to me at her kitchen table about a month after we got her out of that house. We were up late after Miles had gone to sleep. She'd made tea, and we were just sitting there, and she said, "Dad, you don't have to keep checking on me. I know you're checking." I said, "I know you know." She looked at her mug for a moment. Then she said, "I should have called sooner." I kept thinking I could handle it. I kept thinking if I just figured out the right way to manage everything, it would get better. I said, "You called when you called. That's what matters." She said, "You were there in 40 seconds. I said, 45 maybe. I had to find my keys. She laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd heard from her in a long time, the kind that comes up unexpectedly and surprises the person doing it. And I thought, that right there. That is what I went to that parking lot for. That is the thing I would do it again for without hesitation, and the full knowledge of what it makes me and what it cost me. I'm not asking anyone to do what I did. The laws in your state may be different. The circumstances may be different. The man you're dealing with may be more dangerous or have better lawyers or be better at covering his tracks. I got lucky in ways I might not have. What I am saying is this: trust the quiet voice. The one that says something is wrong before you have evidence. The one that says the bruise isn't a cabinet door. The one that says your daughter's laugh has changed. That voice knew before I did. I should have listened to it sooner. Document everything. Learn your state's recording consent laws. Know that the legal system is a tool, not a guarantee. It works better when you help it work. And if you're a father watching your child disappear into a life you didn't choose for her and couldn't see coming, understand that the most important thing you can do is make absolutely sure she knows that when she's ready to make that call, you will pick up. You will be there. You will not make her explain or justify or wait. You will be in the truck before she finishes the sentence. Miles turned 2 last month. We had a small party at our house. Balloons, a cake with a fire truck on it because right now he believes fire trucks are the pinnacle of human achievement. He stood in front of the cake with his eyes absolutely enormous while we sang. And when it was done, he looked at me with this expression of total disbelief, like he couldn't process that all of this had been organized in his honor. I thought about who he would have been growing up in that house. I thought about the version of Miles who learned. The way children learn the things nobody intends to teach them. That love and fear live in the same room. That thought is one I don't spend time on if I can help it, because the version of Miles blowing out 2 candles with his whole face is the one that's real. He got them both on the first try. I keep coming back to the 45 seconds it took me to get to my truck. Not because I'm proud at how fast I moved, but because I think about how long Abby waited before she made that call. 18 months. And I think about what it cost her to stay quiet for all of it, the calculations she made every single day, the energy it takes to hold a secret that is also a wound. She is one of the most capable people I know. She runs codes at a hospital. She makes decisions under pressure that most people couldn't make with unlimited time, and she still couldn't get herself to that phone for 18 months. That tells you something important about what that kind of fear does to a person. It doesn't take away your strength, it redirects it. All of it goes towards surviving the present moment, and there's nothing left to spend on the future. What I did in that parking lot was legal. I've said that, but the reason it worked wasn't luck, and it wasn't just the law. It worked because I'd paid attention for 2 years before the call ever came. I'd watched Abby's laugh change. I'd noticed the way she held her shoulders differently when Curtis was in the room. I'd filed things away without knowing why. People talk about street smarts or gut instinct like they're separate from intelligence, but they're not. The most important thinking I did in this whole situation wasn't the part where I looked up recording consent laws. It was the part where I chose to take my own observations seriously instead of explaining them away. Knowledge without the honesty to act on it is just a comfortable lie you tell yourself. And then there was the part that required something different from me entirely. The part where I had to hold it together, where I had to walk into that parking lot and have a 20-minute conversation with a man who had cracked my daughter's ribs while she was carrying my grandson, and I had to keep my voice level and my hands still and let him talk. That was the hardest thing I've done in my life, and I've done some hard things. The oil rig workers, the soldiers, the people who do dangerous physical work, they'll tell you that the hardest discipline isn't physical. It's the kind where everything in you is screaming one thing and you make yourself do another. I needed a confession, not a fight, so I stayed calm. The outcome depended on it. Here's what I believe, having come through the other side of all of it, the 3 things that actually determine how a story like this ends are not resources or luck or connections. They're whether you're honest enough to see what's in front of you, whether you're clear-headed enough to figure out what to do about it, and whether you have the discipline to do the hard thing instead of the easy one. Abby had all 3. She just needed time to get to the phone. I hope I had enough of all 3 to deserve being the one she called. Miles painted a picture of me last week, orange blob on a green background. His name for it was Papa. I have it on the refrigerator. Every morning when I get my coffee, I look at it and I think, this is what it was for. Not the recording, not the courtroom, not any of it. This orange blob on a green background taped to a refrigerator in Dayton, Ohio. That's the whole point. Don't wait for certainty before you trust what you're seeing. Certainty comes too late.